Okay, hello. Thank you for joining us for BookBound 2020, a From Home literary festival. My name is Amber Massie-Blomfield and I'm a creative non-fiction writer, and I'm here to host a discussion between the authors Daniel M. Ortberg and Rijula Das. This event is being recorded across 3 continents, so please forgive us if there are any technical hiccups. BookBound has been curated in partnership with Wasafiri magazine to raise money for the UK-based mental health charity Mind. Mind provides advice and support to empower people with mental health problems, and their statistics show that on average 1 in 4 people experience mental health problems every year, and as we know, unfortunately 2020 certainly isn't an average year. Make your donation to support Mind using the link to the BookBound Just Giving page displayed below. And now onto our event. American author Daniel M. Ortberg joins us from New York. He is Slate's Dear Prudence advice columnist and a leading writer on issues of gender, identity, and what it means to transition. He is author of Texts from Jane Eyre, a personal favourite of mine, The Merry Spinster, and Something That May Shock and Discredit You, which was just published this February. New Zealand-based Rijula Das's debut novel, A Death in Shonagachi, will be published in late 2020. She holds a PhD in creative writing, and her research examines the relationship between public space and sexual violence in urban India. 2 very different authors on 2 separate continents, but what they share is an uncompromising focus on some of the most contested issues around gender and sexuality today. This exchange has been given the title Challenging Conversations, and what I love about both of these writers is their ability to address sensitive subjects with complexity, compassion, and perhaps most importantly of all, with great humour. I've been laughing a great deal over the last couple of days reading their books. So it's my pleasure to speak to both of them today. Danny and Rijula, hello.
Hi.
Hi. I feel like the first question I have to ask you is how are things going for you both now? Danny, perhaps I can start with you. What's life like for you?
Yeah, it's certainly unusual. My partner and I moved to New York in January, so we're quite new to the city, and it's been hit fairly hard. So my partner was sick for a couple of weeks, and so we had mainly started our quarantine just trying to stay inside and take care of one another as best we could. And now that she's doing better, and we've been able to sometimes take walks, which is really nice. So holding steady, grateful that she got better, but certainly lots to be worried about, lots of friends struggling.
Yeah,
sorry, it's a very open-ended, sad answer, but.
No, we hear things are very tough in New York. So we're, in London, things are pretty tough as well. But yeah, thoughts are with you. Do you find you manage to write in times like this? Is it tough to get writing done?
I would say that I am meeting my basic obligations fairly consistently. And beyond that, I'm not, I have not stunned myself by responding really, really well to this moment. Like I'm meeting my pre-existing deadlines, and I'm not doing much extra stuff is mostly what I'm finding. And that's just been something that has felt pretty crucial to accept, that this is not going to be a time of extreme productivity or creativity for me.
Yeah, so it's sort of the rational response to this time at the moment, isn't it? Actually, is feeling like we're in a state of crisis is the right response to things, Rijula, how are things with you in New Zealand? We certainly envy your Prime Minister in the UK.
She is golden. She's so good, and I'm so glad that this is happening. If it was going to happen with Jacinda in charge, I have to say that it's not been too bad actually, because when we shut down, we had 2 cases of community transmission, which was just unprecedented. So it's been a big change in lifestyle, because we've got a small apartment, so everybody's stuck in the same living room with workstations just going off. But it's not been too bad, you know. I mean, because around us things are not so bad, so it doesn't feel so bad. It just feels like staying at home a lot. But also, where I live is beautiful. You know, if I walk 15 minutes, I get to the ocean, and you can see South Island from here, and there's just a reserve and mountains all around. So it's quite nice to be able to go out and take a walk. But about the writing thing, I have been feeling that pressure. But I think that's because I'm at the later editing stages, so like line edits and just that sort of stage where you're super anxious about every sentence and every word and feeling like you won't have this time again. So that's been, I mean, I know that I keep seeing articles in, like, you know, headlines that say, you know, don't put that pressure on yourself. I get it, but like it's also very hard to resist. Like, when else am I going to be home before 8 p.m.? But yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's very difficult, even in this time of crisis, I think, to sort of shake off the capitalist mindset and the feeling that, you know, you've been given this time and you should be using it in some way productively. And yeah, I really find myself trying to resist that as well. One of the silver linings, though, I guess, is that we can have this conversation across 3 continents, and it's perhaps a conversation we wouldn't be having if we all had to be in the same room. So I'm very grateful for that. I wonder if I can ask you to just tell me a little bit about your books, just to give a little bit of context to our conversation. Danny, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this is my 3rd book, and I have it with me. There's a very wonderfully sort of hysterically upset person whose face is crumbling on the front, which I really like. It's a collection of essays and what I call interludes, which are sometimes reworked poetry, sometimes a sort of bit of yelling, sometimes other sort of fantastical bits of not quite essays, that all have to do with various religious and literary and pop cultural figures that have been really important in my writing over the years, kind of viewed in the context of my transition. And specifically, I think the sort of like 18 months that I spent kind of working out within myself, whether or not I was going to transition, how much, sorry to like use kind of goofy language, but like how much was I going to transition, and whether or not that was something that I was kind of entitled to do or welcome or allowed to do. And that's what this book is, yeah.
Can you tell us the story about where the title came from?
Yes, I can, very much. That was something that came together before anything else in the book did. It's a line from an old Simpsons episode from a character called Lionel Hutz, who was voiced by the great late Phil Hartman, who is very near and dear to me. And I don't know if you watched that show much, but Lionel Hutz was this sort of perpetually sweaty con man of a character who was always trying to like get a different grift going, often through his job as a lawyer. But he was like, if that guy from The Music Man were always flop sweating and falling apart, that would sort of be his thing. So it's this wonderful moment of sort of like catastrophic male failure, and he's trying to discredit another person who has photographic memory by saying, what kind of tie do I have on? And the character names flawlessly, you know, like it's a Windsor knot club tie with red and white stripes. And he just incredibly ostentatiously like whips around and is like, oh, is that what you think? Well, if that's what you think, then let me tell you something that may shock and discredit you. And that is that I'm not wearing a tie at all. Like, and he's just completely obviously ripped it off. It's such a like fragrant moment when it comes to something like evasiveness, failure, panicking, lying, losing all credibility. And so that was sort of the thing I knew before I knew anything else, was that was what I wanted in the book.
I love that you're going to tell that story so many times for the rest of your life now. You're kind of bound to it forever.
Anything that brings attention to Phil Hartman, you know, I'll take it.
Absolutely. And how has it been for your book to come out at this point as well? Because it came out in February, did it?
Yeah. I feel really grateful that I was able to do a couple of in-person events before we had kind of realized the extent of how seriously we were going to have to take this. So I feel really lucky that I got to see some people in public in February. And beyond that, it feels just so outside of my control. Like there was no way I could have done anything differently to avoid this. So I think a combination of, I feel like I got kind of lucky, and then also act of God, nothing I could have done either way.
We'll have a good chat about it all today, this evening. Rijula, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, it's my debut novel, and it started as a bit of a fun project, and I used to call it The Mistress for a very long time, because I was writing this very serious, very literary book that was boring me to tears for my PhD, and I just couldn't get anywhere. Like it had to be like this big thing, and I think somewhere I was trying to be, and now I realize very male in my, or what I imagined to be this, this grandmaster sort of late middle-aged male author. And because I felt like, it was trite to write about yourself as a first book, as a woman. There was something like that, and nobody placed these restrictions on me. These just came out of somewhere inside of me. And I was trying to write this very literary book that was just boring me to death. But then I started writing a sex scene between an erotic novelist who is very short, very weak, has a number of diseases, and is madly in love with a prostitute who is raising her rates and wants to have nothing to do with him anymore. So that was the first scene. That's where the book opens, and it just took a life of its own. But it was very entertaining to write. I remember, so I constantly cheated on my very worthy book with my mistress project on the side, till my supervisor said, "This one's a lot more fun. Why don't you just write this one?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay. I mean, the other one's not going so well anyway." So, yes, it's a story about the red light district in Calcutta. Calcutta is a city I lived in from about when I was 15 to 21, and so those were like really formative years. And this is Asia's largest red light district. So they have about, reports vary, but I want to say something about 15,000, because the numbers go from like 10, 11 to 18. And that's the number of registered sex workers. So there are unregistered or floating people who come in there and work and then go away. So they're not necessarily in that census. There are families, children, people who live there, shopkeepers who run their shops there. So it's a little city inside a city. And the story is about a prostitute who is trying to become an escort. And I use the word prostitute because there is a tussle between being a sex worker and the rights to legitimize and form a union as a labor union, and being a sex worker there. So there's a tussle, there's a political naming problem there in the book. So I'm sorry, that's a very vague way of describing it, but it's part escape story, part rights to live where you live and to do the work that you do, and the politics that come into that.
Brilliant. And I'm hoping we might talk a little bit about sort of language and sex work in our conversation. So yeah, that's an interesting point to pick up on. I think you've both got really fascinating alternative lives. Rijula, you're an academic. This has kind of emerged out of your academic work, but you're also a translator and a plain language consultant. Now, can you explain what a plain language consultant does using plain language?
Well, that's the hardest bit. I help mostly organizations, which in my case happens to be mostly New Zealand government agencies, write simply and for the audience. So we do a lot of work with insurance, with our ministries, our ministries of education, the children welfare, so that the stuff that they do put out for the public or not for the public, is read by all. So it sort of comes from that social engagement bit where you believe that people have a right to that information, and that if you're not making it accessible in language, it's not just putting it on your website, but about making it accessible. If you're not doing that, then you're failing in your duty. So that's where we come from, and there's a lot of traction, at least in New Zealand. People are fully on board, and people do believe that it should be accessible. So basically, I'm a writing coach for adults about public policy.
Mm-hmm. And have you found that sort of fed into your work on your book?
Not really, because I wrote this book in 2015. I sold it in 2017, and it's 2020, and I'm still waiting for it to come out. So it's been a long journey, and I only started working as a plain language consultant last year. So it hasn't fit in so much as for this book. But what it does is that I get to still work with writing related things in my waking life, sort of, but as opposed to doing something completely, let's say, different. But it doesn't drain me from that creative energy, if that makes any sense. So it just doesn't, it's adjacent, and it fits quite well. So and it's quite a relief to sort of go into an insurance document when you're stuck in a literary document. So it's very nice to just sort of switch gears, the same tools, but just different things.
I do want to say as well, if you've got questions or you want to exchange with each other as we go along, please do hop in. Otherwise, I'll just dominate it with my list of burning questions that I've got. But yes, just because we're not in the same room, please do feel free to do that. Can you tell us a bit about your life as an agony columnist, Danny?
Yeah, so I have been running the Dear Prudence advice column over at Slate now since I want to say late 2016, but it may have been late 2017. I'm very bad at remembering when things have happened in my life, so that's we can look that up. Somebody can figure that out. But it's been a column for quite a long time, since the late 90s, actually. So I'm the fourth or the fifth Dear Prudence to sort of step into that role. So one of the things that's quite nice is that it came along as an opportunity that was already very much, here's how the job works, here's some of the tone of the Dear Prudence kind of persona, but then also here are ways in which you can bring your own ideas into bear. And so it felt like walking into a very tightly regimented assembly line. So it's unlike a lot of other jobs I've had as a writer, because usually writing jobs don't come with a lot of like very specific instructions, like here's when you clock in, here's when you clock out, you're done. So I actually have always really appreciated that structure and that aspect. But it's really a job that takes up about 3 days out of my week, and then I try as much as I can when I'm not in those 3 days to not think about it. So in a lot of ways, it feels very siloed off from my writing, but then I also kind of catch myself reusing or going back to particular phrases or particular points over and over again in both my work as Dear Prudence and in my writing elsewhere. So I think it's a little bit of a fantasy that I think like, oh, no, I just do this 3 days a week for years and years, and it never affects anything else. I just have this big iron wall I can jam down. I don't think that's quite as true as I would like it to be.
Yeah, it's sort of there's one of the parts of your book that really stuck with me was when you were talking about how when you really started to listen to yourself and pay attention to how you were feeling, that was sort of when you started to wonder about your transition. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something really interesting about how when we take on listening roles for other people in life, that can sometimes reflect in us understanding ourselves better somehow. I don't know if that...
Oh, incredibly so. And incredibly so. I think part of the reason that I had sort of justified going back into therapy in late 2016 or 2017, whenever that was I was thinking, well, I'm always telling people, if you have the time and if you can afford it, go to therapy. Maybe I should do that again. It's been a few years. So it was very much also like that job informing personal choices, which later informed my writing, because I went to therapy and almost immediately was like, I think I might be a boy. Can we talk about that? And almost nothing else for years and years. She was like, sure.
Great. And I think it's really one thing that struck me about your books, I mean, you are such different writers in a lot of ways, but I feel like you're both extremely compassionate writers, and you both, in your writing, it feels to me like you have a lot of compassion for people who might be the sort of antagonists within your text. So with Rijula's writing, you write very compassionately from the perspective of, the people who are going to the sex workers, to, from the perspective of the police who perhaps haven't been supporting the sex workers very well. And, I felt in your writing, Danny, you write very compassionately about people who perhaps haven't been supportive about, as supportive as they might be about your transition. And yeah, I guess my question is really about the place of compassion in both of your writing, and whether that feels like an important thing, particularly at this moment, which for various reasons doesn't feel, a particularly compassionate time around a lot of questions about gender. So I guess, yeah, that's a big question, but Danny, perhaps I can ask you.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the word I might be inclined to use slightly more than compassion is patience in my writing. Because I don't think I'm always writing from a compassionate place, but because it's writing, because I'm able to take my time and to consider the other perspective, there is, I think, an inherent respect that comes with patience, with taking time to sit with someone else's thought or ideas or possible motivations or possible thoughts. And so I certainly think that can be a compassionate act, and it can be a useful act, and one that I value. But I also think that the act of imagination and patience can also lead me to decide to withhold compassion. And I think that's important as well. I think there are, without maybe going as far as saying there are certain persons who I would never want to extend compassion towards. I don't think I would go so far as to say that, but there are certain positions that I would want to say, I would investigate this. I would give it the respect of listening to it describe itself. I would want to be patient as I considered it. And then I would want to make a decision about whether or not I thought it merited compassion. That feels like a useful choice, both as a writer and as a person. And thinking, I know this is more for your book, but thinking too, especially about, the importance of withholding compassion from the police. Like as an individual person, I think I would not want to extend compassion towards the job of policing. It might be something that I would give a lot of thought to or consideration to, but it's that feels distinct to me. I
think you're right. I suppose what I'm identifying really is something. It is about that quality of thought, actually, and perhaps you're right that compassion's not the right word, but maybe it's more about complexity or granularity. It's about, it feels that, there's something in the quality of both of these books that feels very antithetical to the way discourse around issues about gender and so on are conducted in the social media sphere. And I think actually a lot of that is attention, and maybe what I'm confusing for compassion is a certain quality of attention that I really value in both of these books.
And to be clear, I don't think you were confusing anything. I just wanted to add a little to that thought, but I think compassion makes a ton of sense.
I hear what you're saying, and that's really very interesting, Daniel, because I see that choice you make when you decide, well, it's not compassion, but I'm quite happy with the word compassion, but also the complexity and granular quality that you mean. But I wonder if I would feel that the way that you feel, Danny, if I was doing more personal essays, like I don't know. I think the next novel that I'm gonna write is gonna be very close to my heart. It is about physical violence against children in India. It's a very big part of how we grew up. Everybody was trashed regularly, just like, they were in the West 50, 70 years ago. So, oh, not 50, 2020, right? So yeah, a bit longer back than that. But I mean, and I don't know how I will deal with that. So I don't know how I would do if it was more personal essays or nonfiction or creative nonfiction in some kind. With fiction, however, I mean, I would find it very hard to write something or about somebody that I did not feel compassion for. And like my, my police officer character, he's, I don't know if it's compassion exactly, but like I mean, I'm looking into his life. I'm looking at what happens when he goes home. Like he's just gotten married. Like he has a very young. He's none of the good things that I would value politically or as a person. He's none of those things. But I just feel like if I didn't know who he was, or see him when he's not a policeman or things like that, even if those are bad things, then I wouldn't be able to write him with any sort of credibility. And there are characters in the book that I do absolutely nothing with, and they have only this, they sort of come in as shadow people and beat other people up, but that's as far as I can see into them, because I have no quality of compassion for them, if that makes sense. Like I have no, I cannot I cannot understand them as people. So I'm not extended their quality of compassion, but that also means that I'm not really writing them. They're just this shadowy sort of thuggish figures in the background who are causing a certain amount of violence. So I guess that's, I wouldn't be able to write about them otherwise.
Rijula, I wanted to ask you about, there's sort of one of the aspects of your book is this this kind of movement that started by the sex workers in the book. They use hashtag not one more, and there's a bit of a parallel there with the Me Too movement. I wanted to ask you about the community you're writing about sex workers in India, and how they have been impacted, if at all, by the Me Too movement, because it can often feel like something that has been quite sort of centered around, quite privileged white feminism. And I wonder if it's something that you feel has impacted upon sex workers in India.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speak for the community, because, I have absolutely zero rights to do so. But from what I have observed or studied or researched, I think I will, that Not One More was fictional. It was made up by me. And it obviously had tones of Me Too. But I think Me Too was more about, for me at least, about speaking out about these incidents, and I have too. There's things that happened to me that I've talked about during the Me Too, but I think it was very much, even in India, at least from what I saw, and that might be a limitation on my part and the people I associate with in my bubble, honestly, my very liberal, privileged bubble, is that it was a chance for people like ourselves who are fairly privileged, fairly middle class, educated, to speak up, because what I observe from the movement and the struggles, the political struggles that the sex workers in India are, it's still quite a lot rawer than that. I mean, it's about the right to be legal. It's not legal in India. I mean, to begin with, to be legal, to have the right to be recognized as workers with the labor union, and so and the right not to die, very honestly. So it's still very I mean, I don't think that we're at very, I mean, some parts of Me Too were to do with the nuance of what happens when you didn't really say yes, or yes, maybe you were not penetrated, but you were shut up in a room and like terrified by a bunch of men. So that's but I guess where my book is happening, or the place and the community I'm talking of, it's very much about death and violence and a lot cruder threats, I would say. So that was not a very good explanation, but it's just trying to say that I mean, I don't think that Me Too affected it that much as some other things have done, like for example COVID or demonetization. I mean, it's this, and India went through a demonetization when our prime minister decided that one currency was no longer valid, and this is an entirely cash economy. These people, most of these people are relying on cash. Same with the COVID situation. It's just what's happening right now is that it's another AIDS level of crisis, except with AIDS you could have protection, but with COVID you have none, and there is no healthcare system to fall back on. So it's I would say that those things would have a much huger impact on the already very fragile and tenuous social structure where my people are living, that sort of thing.
It's an extraordinary aspect of your book, actually, where you talk about that a couple of banknotes suddenly being removed out of the currency in India, which was something I didn't know about at all. And then I went and Googled it, and just imagining the impact on an economy that, a lot of the economy, I suppose, is not formalized, is quite casual, when suddenly 2 banknotes get taken out of circulation with basically no warning, is a really, really extraordinary and fascinating part of the book.
Yeah, especially people who rely on that cash, because a lot of these women, they don't have say an ID card to go and create a bank account. So where are they going to keep the money? I mean, the collective, the women's collective, it is a real thing. I've changed the name. So they do run a bank, a cooperative bank for all sex workers over there. It's run by the sex workers themselves. But I mean, before that happened, it's cash in mattresses, and anybody could come and kill you or beat you up and take that cash. And that it's just huge impacts of people who live in primarily a cash economy where they're working every single day to feed themselves. So when you take cash away, COVID comes, or somebody decides to pull banknotes out of a currency, it has so many ramifications there. It's just like mind boggles, really.
Yeah, this is it with, COVID-19. It does feel like it's sort of screwing the world in so many unimaginable ways. I feel like every single day I'm sort of, and coming across a new way that people have been screwed by it, and it's really devastating. Danny, I wanted to ask you about, one of the really fascinating aspects of your book in relation to sort of feminism and the Me Too movement and so on is when you talk about how, one of the things you talk about is how one of the struggles around your transition was the idea that you were perhaps turning your back on womanhood, or, stepping away from feminism. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about
Yeah, I don't know that my work in this book ever directly engages Me Too, but I certainly do spend some time in conversation with various, there's so many different exciting flavors of transphobia, and I think one of the ones that I was particularly in conversation with in the writing of this book was this kind of idea that transmasculine transition deprives a feminist community of a shared resource, which is the transmasculine person's body, and that other people have a right to that body in a way that the person who lives in it does not, and that the kind of autonomy and freedom and self-determination that can come with transition can be framed as a shameful or a harmful act that somehow damages the idea of the feminist community. that can be leveraged against people who are considering like transmasculine transition in really painful ways. And I think certainly for me, one of the things that I both had to wrestle with internally and also from some of the people in my life was this sort of idea that, you know, don't you agree that in fact, you are a steward of a public resource in your body and that you owe it to other people to do the following things with it and not to do these things with it, in ways that were just unbelievably painful, shameful, devastating. And I think, you know, there's so many different ways that transphobia can take shape in people's lives and convince you that transition's the one thing you can't do, right? Like it's somehow both like, it's so desirable that like people must be protected from hearing about it because anyone who heard about it would be like, my God, I must do it. But it's simultaneously so bad that anyone who did it would immediately realize it doesn't actually work. It fails, it ruins something good. So it can kind of get framed as both like this like forbidden contagion. It's like, oh, if you ever heard of transition, you'd want to do it because it's so alluring, like the castle in like, or like the gingerbread house in Hansel and Gretel, but so dangerous that you would immediately die, like if you went inside the gingerbread house in Hansel and Gretel. And so trying to kind of work through how do you think about desire and about the body in ways that don't operate under those sort of like shameful, normative, controlling principles is a real challenge. And I think it's also hard sometimes to separate from, you know, garden variety sexism and then the sometimes like weird responses people can develop in response to said sexism. So it can kind of be like, well, I sort of feel bad being a girl, but everyone says that's how you know you're a girl, is that you feel bad. So maybe this just means I'm doubly a woman. And that can be confusing, right? Like, well, you're supposed to
deal with, isn't it?
You're supposed to feel bad when you look in the mirror, so.
Yeah, I was so struck by that idea of you know, the sort of female body existing in public ownership. And you wrote, there's a part of the book that's really stuck with me is when you're talking about people saying, I feel as if someone died, and that really relating to ownership of people in some way, and also the term dead naming as well, which I'm afraid is something that I've used in the past and, you know, had my perspective really changed. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Quickly, I would just say, I don't use the language in my book of female body. That's not how I experience my own body. I understand why sometimes people use it, but I personally do not. But yeah, I think that question of, golly, I'm sorry. I do this to myself sometimes. I go down a little track and then I forget what I was going to say. So it's just been completely wiped out of my brain, and I hope you'll both bear with me.
No, not at all.
Would you mind awfully asking me the question again?
I'll ask you the question again. And sorry if it was the wrong terminology to use.
Oh, I've remembered it now. Thank you.
Yes, about dead naming.
Yeah.
That.
So part of what I also do in the book is I kind of examine the phrase dead naming. I kind of address, I think, the fact that some people use the phrase dead naming, others don't. I find that I tend to more often use birth name, or sometimes, depending the context, legal name. For me, my birth name is still my legal name. I filed to have it changed a while ago, but the government's very busy at present, so I'm not holding my breath waiting for that paper to get mailed back to me anytime soon. Yeah, I think certainly attempting to use someone's former name as a way of demonstrating to them, I don't recognize your right to make decisions about how you think about yourself. I believe that I have the right to make the final decision about what you're called, and I want you to know that is on its face pretty obviously an act of control and cruelty. But I also, you know, I also understand that there are people who don't associate former names with death and don't want to bring that language into it either. So I've also experienced people using an old name of mine out of habit and then correcting themselves. To me, that doesn't fall into the same category. Obviously, of course, there's ways that people can avoid change in ways that can be challenging, but I think there's different ways that people can approach the use of attempting to respect somebody else's autonomy, attempting to respect somebody else's change. So sometimes I call it dead naming. Mostly I tend to call it former name or birth name. I tend to think, as a general principle, if you're going to take someone, if you're going to say who ultimately gets to decide what a person's name is, I think the answer kind of has to be the person themselves, because otherwise, you know, do you say their parents forever? Do you say anyone that they talk to gets to decide? Their teachers? I think the simplest is to say, yeah, I get to call my name, you get to pick yours.
Yeah, I think it was particularly interesting to me, the sort of the idea of the terminology about death, and the idea that it feels like someone has died. That passage was so powerful that, you know, people choose to use the terminology about death is challenging.
Yeah, I certainly I don't want to tell someone else, here's how you should feel about something. I understand we don't choose our feelings. But I do think we can choose the ways that we describe our feelings, and we can choose carefully metaphorical language. And I think finding a way to talk about sorrow, grief, poignancy, nostalgia, conflict are all possible without invoking the language of death. And I think particularly because nobody dies in a transition. It's very much the work of life. It's the you know, I'm not a religious person, but I do talk about religious stories and language in the book. And in the Christian idea of the Garden of Eden, the very first work that human beings were given was the act of bestowing names upon living things. And so I think there's something really fundamental about the work of naming and the work of generation and of life and of aliveness, such that I think if somebody wants to discuss sadness or conflict, I want to leave room for that. But I think saying it's like a death fundamentally misunderstands reality, and I think is unnecessarily painful, because, you know, then the transitioning person hears that and is like, well, sorry, I killed someone. Like, I don't know what to say to that. I have a new name, possibly a new haircut, but I'm very much not dead. So sorry, I've rambled on now. I'll stop for a minute.
No, that's brilliantly expressed, and yeah, it is so potent in your book, that section. I loved it and felt very moved by it. I feel like I should point out as well that these are both very funny books. You know, I don't want everyone to feel they're exclusively heavy, and that's one of the beautiful things as well, that you both write so fantastically about, you know, sensitive subject matter with great humour. Do you think that humour kind of well, I suppose the question is what role you think humour has to play in dealing with sensitive issues? Rijula, perhaps you could talk about it a little bit.
Well, I'm just gonna just pick up on what Danny was just saying earlier. You know, about the whole thing about naming, and I kind of get what you mean, just because it's also, you know, it's some part of so many religious cultures where you reach a certain age and then you acquire a name because you're reborn. Certainly among Hindu Brahmins, they don't get a new name, but I know that Muslims have Akika, where you get a name. You know, it's a naming ceremony. You have a ceremony around being named, even if it's your birth name. So there's a whole ritual of being born again or being alive again, but it doesn't mean that you've been dead before. You're transitioning. I mean, you know, everybody's transitioning, even if they're not transitioning from their gender. You're just transitioning into a different stage of your life. And I was just thinking about it because there's a naming thing happening in my book as well, because sex workers will often take on a different name, or there's a huge a number of girls from Uzbekistan or that part of the world who work in many other parts, but also in India. And, you know, those names are sometimes very hard for people to say, so they come up with another name. So, I mean, I'm not equating anything. I'm just saying that's what came to my mind, because there are so many transitions, and there's so much about naming. It's just been such a big part of our collective consciousness. And I mean, in Christianity or in other world traditions, the whole aspect of naming and becoming something, like you know, even in horror fiction, like you give a thing a name and it comes alive, you know, like it stays with you forever. And that's so very true. So I'm just like, I don't know, those were just my thoughts when I heard you talking about humor. I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan, so I obviously worship at the altar of humor and using humor to tell difficult things. But I do not, I never suspected that I had the ability to do it. I always enjoyed it, but I never thought I had the ability. So it was when the first feedback of my you know, the first draft of the novel came, that people mentioned it was funny, and I was very stoked, because I didn't think I was a particularly funny person. I mean, nobody's ever told me that I'm a funny person, so I was quite happy about that. But I felt very strongly, I think, in the very beginning of the book, that I didn't want to write a doom and gloom story, because it is not a doom and gloom story. You know, it's just, I think people outside of the sex work life have an expectation, when they're not very familiar with the actual people and their lives, that it is all doom and gloom and sadness, which is, you know, I mean, yes, it's a very hard life, especially in places where it's not always a matter of choice. I want to say that it's not always a matter of choice. So sometimes it is a matter of choice, but of circumstance where just the state machinery and the cultural machinery is very much against you, and stuff like that. Yes, it is very hard, but also it's just life. You know, it's just life. They have families, they have friendships. It's like a large number of females living together in a house. You form friendships. You know, you talk about money, you fight over things, you scold your children. It's life as usual, and it's funny as well. You know, I mean, it's not necessary just by I think somewhere I was working against the idea that because circumstances are against somebody, that their lives therefore must be unbearably sad. I just don't think that that's true. And it just felt very important to talk about life as is, which includes laughter. You can't have a story. You can't authentically tell somebody's story that has zero element of joy or laughter. I mean, that's just a very sad way of writing, I think.
Danny?
I don't know that I have much to add there. I think I'm very much of the same mind. Yeah, that was fabulous.
Do you think any topics are off limits for humour?
I suppose I would say that there are plenty of ways in which humor it can't be the final word in a discussion. So I don't know that I would say there are the following topics where humor can never be interestingly deployed in the service of the discussion. But I think there's also lots of ways in which humor can be protective or avoidant, or as a way of rushing through ambiguity or uncertainty, or trying to avoid discomfort. So I think that there are plenty of conversations where humor is employed either offensively or defensively in order to avoid the work that only other kinds of speech can do. So yeah, I don't know that there's a topic that's totally off limits, but certainly I can think of a few where there's only a handful of jokes you can get through, and then once you've gotten through them, the conversation's not over. So you do have to think of something else. Weirdly, I've been rewatching with my partner a couple of some of my old favorite Ernst Lubitsch films. I don't know if either of you are familiar with his work. He did, probably if you're familiar with any of his work, it would be The Shop Around the Corner, which was later the inspiration for You've Got Mail. but his films were referred to as having something called the Lubitsch touch, which I love. I just love as an expression, but it wasn't a phrase that he coined, and so it was a little bit difficult to define. But people talked about this kind of marriage of sophistication, humor with poignancy, like in these lovely kind of sparkling, almost screwball, but a little bit slowed down conversations between like very like sexually charged adults. There would always be this sense of like loss or resignation to a potential future loss. And that, I think, is the kind of humor that I often like the most or respond to the most, because it's not humor that's attempting to shut down other things. It's humor that allows for the expression of multiple emotional perspectives at the same time. So it's like humor as sophistication, which I like quite a lot. So.
Well, you said humour can't be the last word, but I'm looking at my watch and it looks like I've got a million more questions I want to ask you both, but I think we had better wrap it up and come to the end. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to hear your readings, but I was going to ask you one last question, which is, as you're both writers, you're probably quite used to spending lots of time locked away on your own, and I wondered if you could both share a top tip for surviving the lockdown. Rijula, can I ask you first?
Sure. I think at this moment, I'm just going to talk about what's the top of my mind, is to have a bit of internet detox, really, because I think I'm used to spending a lot of time on my own, but I think that there's this added pressure, I think, to be connected because you're working from home, because we are anxiety scrolling and all of those things. And just the picture that's emerging out of most of the world, including the politics of the moment, is just so heartbreaking in so many ways. It's just, I've found that it's adding an extra layer of exhaustion on top of everything else. Just I think the profound sadness of how we are as a species dealing with it in so many places. So I would say making it a priority to have some time when you're not doing something that's technologically connecting you to the world. And now that I'm saying this while you're probably watching this on YouTube, but read a book, like don't stare at a screen. Give yourself that time when you don't have your headphones on or something. I think that improves. That will have a significant improvement in our mental health, and it's been working for me. And I have fragile mental health at best, so I can recommend it.
So switch off after finishing watching your BookBound talks. That's a
yes.
Danny, do you have a quick tip?
Gosh, it's hard because so many people are in such different positions. So, what might work for somebody who has a spare room might not work for somebody else who's like an essential worker, somebody else who's, with 5 kids. So acknowledging that I can't give any piece of advice that's going to be useful to even most people, I would say if one of the problems you have right now is more time on your hands than you know how to fill, and if you're able to safely leave the house, consider looking to see if there are any mutual aid groups that are forming or have already formed in your city. If part of the problem is just a real sense of I can't motivate myself, you might find that it's easier when you can do some even behind the scenes volunteer work that helps people with training or dispatch. Just anything that makes you feel like, oh, I did something useful today, can sometimes be more motivating than should I start writing a novel? So if that's your situation, that might be helpful.
That is totally fantastic advice. Thank you so much. That brings this conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Daniel and Rijula, and to everyone at home for joining BookBound 2020. There are lots of great events like this in the programme. Search for BookBound 2020 on Twitter and Instagram to learn more and help us spread the word using the hashtag BookBound 2020. if you'd like to buy the work of our authors, and you can also buy my book, the link is going to be in the text below this video, and it's going to take you through to Hive, which is a website that specifically supports independent bookshops, so a much better website to use than a certain other major retailer. Links to the books discussed here and a discount code on select festival titles are below, and you'll also find our authors' favourite independent bookshops across the globe listed there. So that's everything. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Rijula. Bye.
Thanks,
Wonderful to meet
Amber.
you
That was
both.
lovely.
Thank you.